thanks for being here. Today I'm going to talk about my 9 top tips for migrating millions of records to Salesforce. Why I picked this topic is because when you work with large data volumes, you often find that upfront you don't know what you don't know. I've done a couple of LDV migrations in the past, and what I find is that when you start out with Salesforce, you'll learn to work with Salesforce in a specific way, but those are actually the best practices. Sorry? Sorry. Bear like this? Yeah. Okay. You often learn that you have to use sales in a specific way, but what I found is that those best practices that you're taught are often the simplest and cheapest best practices for your use case. And once you move up in complexity and in org size, you'll find that you have to take a different approach to doing migrations, to do integrations, and also your implementations. And that's why I picked this topic. So what I'm going to talk about today, as you can see, the title is a bit of a lie. It's not actually 9 top tips, it's more like 9 top subjects. I'm going to start out with pre-migration steps. What do you have to look into before you start with the migration or even the implementation? Migration plan, the approach, how you're going to actually migrate those records. The tooling, so there's a couple of ETL tools and integration tools that you can use, and each have their own advantages and disadvantages. Your implementation, and most specifically the automation, you really have to bulkify this, because with large data volumes you'll find you hit into limits, the governor limits, much faster. Determine the best place for your data prep. What you see often is that a client has a system, maybe on-premise, with an old database that's very normalized, and you have to denormalize it. You have to refactor the data model from the old system to put it into Salesforce, but it also means that you have to consolidate your data. You have to merge certain tables in your source before you can put them into Salesforce and make transformations. And often there's also an improvement step involved, because you don't want to replicate the old system, you want to improve upon the old system, and maybe not just evolve, but revolutionize your business. That means that you have to transform and prep your data. Then optimize for the purpose of data, which is linked to number 6, because you don't want to move all your data, you want to move just the right data into your org and the right format. Optimize the migration process and prevent issues. And last but definitely not least, testing, reruns, and error processing, because in any case you'll need those. So a little bit by myself. I'm Jansen. I'm a technical consultant and architect at Integris FieldBuddy. It's a consulting partner and ISV partner in one. I've got 18 certifications. I've been working with Salesforce for about 3.5 years now. So the first topic, pre-migration steps. Always important when you have an LDV system that you're coming from, so a system with millions of records. Maybe not in every table, but at least in some tables. First off, you want to identify which tables those are, because it will be very important before you even start with your implementation to adjust any automation for those tables, for those objects in Salesforce for that volume. Also very important, key accounts, key information. Nice anecdote, not too long ago, think about a year, I did a migration through integration at a customer of mine. And I was very happy with the results, because I migrated accounts, wasn't strictly speaking large data volumes, was about 400,000, and I only got 0.25% failures. Turned out those were actually the key accounts. So I told the customer it's only 0.25% failures, and he was like, yeah, but I'm missing this account, because he started testing, and of course he started testing with his most important accounts, his key accounts. And that's the actual information that was missing. So before you start, also know what is the key information for your customer. Know their business, know their clients. Next step, determine what data should move to Salesforce. With LDV, this is probably your most important step, because you definitely don't want to put everything in Salesforce, because it's not built uh, as an as an archiving solution or as a data storage, a data silo, and also as a calculation platform. If you want to try calculations on a very large data set, millions of records, you're definitely going to run into limits with Salesforce. So you should always determine what data should move to Salesforce and why, and for what purpose do I want to use this data in Salesforce. Does it have to be in the same form, or can I aggregate data? Also important, of course, is the actual storage size. Not too long ago, I think before February this year, you only got 1 gigabyte for Salesforce org standards, plus I think 20 megabytes per license, if I'm correct. And they moved it up to 10 gigabytes, which gives you about 5 million records in total. But with large data volumes, 5 million is more or less the lower edge. So if you want to move maybe 10 million, 20 million, even more records into Salesforce, you're going to have to buy extra storage, which is expensive. So you don't want to buy too much, but you definitely want to have enough that you can put all the data in there and then also account for growth. So you don't want the customer to already buy more storage in 1 month, in 2 months or something. At least for 5 or 6 months, they should be good. Live org, very important one. If you do a new implementation, you have an old system with a large database, you want to move to Salesforce, it's less critical because, well, you do a new implementation, it's a new org in Salesforce. You can just move all the data in there and you don't have to merge that much. There's no existing data in your Salesforce org. But if it's a live org with live users, live customers, live data, then you cannot just say, okay, I'm going to turn the whole environment off, the whole org off for 20 days, and just lock every user out and do the migration. So you have to pick your migration windows and also keep the downtime as low as possible, but at the same time avoid any conflicts with running processes. And you have to have a migration plan that involves the merging. What I found with LDV migrations is that a lot of ETL tools, so that's extract, transform, load. So the tools like data loader, Jitterbit, Salesforce data loader. There's a couple other ones you'll come across. They don't work so well for LDV migrations because you're going to work with CSV files in that case that are a couple of gigabytes each. And that requires a lot of memory and processing power. But even then, you find it's very hard to work with these formats. So for LDV migration, I usually would recommend migrating through integrating. And all the integration solutions that are common for Salesforce are licensed and are expensive. So make sure that you know in advance which integration platforms, IPAAS stands for integration platform and as a service. So if a customer already has existing licenses for those, might be interesting to look into that platform to migrate, because they're probably not going to buy a new platform just for the migration. And special features enabled. Think about person accounts, multi-currency. Those have some architectural implications. And you want to take that into account before you do the migration. I've had quite a few issues with those in the past. Then the next step, have a migration plan. First step, always important, identify the team and stakeholders. And the next one, also define the roles for each of those parties and each of those stakeholders and people in your team. Because you always run into issues. It's almost, you almost can't get around that. And at that point, you want to know who you can look at, who you can talk to, and involve all the stakeholders to come to a solution, so that not the whole migration is your sole responsibility. Because with LDV, it's hardly doable. You need someone who knows the old system, who knows the database, also a network or hardware specialist that knows about the maintenance windows, the running process on the server that you're running on, the network limitations, stuff like that. Determine metrics for success. With a large data volume migration, it's very hard, almost impossible to get a 100% perfect migration. So you're always going to have failures, and what you see is that you have to settle for a percentage. And some customers say, well, 80-20 is good enough, but others say, well, I want at least 99%. And you have to challenge your customer, okay, why do you want 99%? Does all the old archive data really have to be in Salesforce. Does every field have to be migrated? Or can we say that if there's a conflict with the new implementation in Salesforce or the old one, that we can just leave this out? Also mentioned before, denormalization plan. What you see with most systems, especially the older ones that are on-premise and also some other cloud stacks, that they have a very normalized data model. So for instance, if you use phone or email or address, you'll create a separate table for email, phone, and address, and then junction tables that link these tables to the place you use them. So if you want to use address on accounts, there's a junction object, a linking table to link address to accounts. Same for leads, for contacts, and the same with phone and email. But in Salesforce, you don't want that. You actually want to consolidate those into the same object. So you want accounts with billing address, shipping address, maybe a couple of phone fields. Same for contact, same for lead. But that means you have to join that data. You have to merge it together before you can migrate it into Salesforce. And you really have to make a plan for that before you start implementing. Because otherwise, you'll design your whole data model in Salesforce, and then you get to the migration part near the end of the implementation, and suddenly you realize, oh crap, I have to refactor a lot of parts of my data model because the data won't fit. However I try to normalize it, denormalize it, it won't fit my data model. So make sure you know what data you have, where you want to go, and make a plan to move from the old situation, old scenario to the new one. And also the migration order is very important with that step, because this migration order is based on the relationships within your data, the dependencies. For instance, if you want your contact to be linked to an account, you first have to import the accounts before you can import the contacts. Then with writing down every step, you don't usually want to do your whole migration in one try. You're going to build it up, you're going to test it, especially if it's a live org, but even if it's a new implementation, you still want to test your migration, have maybe a pilot period or something. And if you then want to do the final migration, you just want your plan to be solid, that you can just follow your plan and you know that if I do all these steps in the right order, then everything will be right and I'll get to the right result. And if you do it differently, or forget certain steps, then you get to a different result, which might not be what the customer wanted. So make sure that you test your migration and you write down every step, and for the final migration you can just repeat that. Sorry. There? That's better? Like I always said, test your plan before you do the final migration. Don't forget the audio anymore, like this.
I can also give you a microphone if you
Yeah, maybe that's better. Yeah.
wonderful things.
Yep. Nope. Test, test, test.
Hello? You can hear it?
This better? Yeah, much better. Woohoo! The migration approach then. So, like I already said, with ETL tools, normal tools you use for importing data, like Salesforce Data Loader, Jitterbit Data Loader, you'll find that you need a lot of memory to work with those large CSV files. And they're often not that suitable for doing reruns, test runs, because any manual steps that you have to do on your data, so you export the old database to CSV files, then you have to transform data. You have to repeat all those steps when you do a rerun, especially if the old system is still live, which it usually is, because you haven't moved to Salesforce yet. So because of that, it's usually a much better solution to do migration through integration. So you, instead of using an ETL to move your data from one system to the other, you use an integration tool, like an integration platform, and build more of a flow kind of migration plan. Well, like I said, file intermediates, I wouldn't recommend them for the, well, previously mentioned reasons. I actually forgot to prepare this one. I'll just skip migration of files, sorry that. Then the API selection. What I found is that with the API selection, it's really a compromise that you have to make. If you want to use the bulk API, it will be obviously faster because of the whole parallelization of the bulk API. So multiple chunks will be imported in parallel for one job. But the problem with that is that if you have multiple parent relationships, you can get locking errors. And if you do it in stages, where you say, okay, first I'm going to import a chunk of this record with one parent relation and all the simple field types like text or number or currency, and then import the other relations in a later phase, then you'll see that the audit fields no longer represent the old system. So if you want to see who last modified a contact in the former system, you can no longer see that because the last modified by and the last modified date will be your user at the time that you import the last stage of that record. So when you choose your API, carefully decide, do I need audit fields, or are there any other considerations why I can't use parallelization through the bulk API, and can I actually do it through another API like the SOAP API or the REST API, because these obviously have their limitations as well. Parallel runs. What you see in a data model is that there are obviously relationships, but there are also quite a few objects or tables in your data model that have no parents, like usually campaign or accounts or the organization itself, which is only one record, but there's always a couple of records at the same level. Product usually also doesn't have a parent, and you can import all these objects, all these tables without any parents at the same time, which can save you a lot of time because you don't have to do it all serial. You can do it in parallel, so you can still have parallelization even if you use a standard SOAP or REST API instead of the bulk API. And for the same reason, for API selection, you also have the consideration of insert plus update versus upsert. With insert is the fastest operation by far. If you move data into Salesforce, update is already a bit slower because the system will first look up the record by ID or by external ID, then fetch the old values, put in the new values and save to the database. And with upsert, there's a mix with that, and upsert performs much worse, but the upside of upsert is, where you combine insert and update into one action, is that you can just hit rerun every time, so you don't have to have two separate parts of your integration. You can just say run it, and if the first time 50% is successful and 50% fails, and they do the next run with some modifications, another 20% is imported, then you won't get any duplicates or any other errors, because you will just update the 50%, add another 20% with insert, and the last 30% will still fail, which you can then iterate again to move those in. But the consideration again here is speed and quality of implementation based on Salesforce best practices versus simplicity and practicality. And the same goes for external ID versus Salesforce ID parent mapping. If you take out, so retrieve the records you imported, like accounts, and match it outside of Salesforce with your contacts, for instance, to create a parent relationship, it will perform faster in the migration, but you have to do all those steps outside of Salesforce. Whereas if you use external ID on the account level, where you import the account ID from the former system and also use that from the table in the of contacts that you're going to import, you can just reference it directly, which will perform worse, but it's much more practical. So these considerations will help you decide what road to use, how you want to migrate this. Then the tooling. I want to start it with hardware. Not really a Salesforce topic, but what you find with LEV migrations is that it's just too much to run locally. I would never recommend to do a migration locally. You'd also always want to do it in the cloud or on a dedicated migration or integration server for the mostly performance reasons, but also because the laptop is just not designed to run 24/7, and it's not. You want to take it home with you. You don't want to leave your laptop at your desk because, well, there's a batch running, it has to run overnight, and I can take it home. I can go to the customer next day. So that's why I would recommend always use a cloud integration or do it on a server, preferably from the customer itself, because it can be the same server as the database server. And make sure that the server has enough memory, because especially if a record has a lot of parent references, then you want to have those records in cache, in memory, when you create the relationships. And to do that, all the data actually has to be loaded. So both your working sets as well as the parent records that you're matching with. And that can require so much memory that you obviously usually can't even do it on a laptop, because a laptop can only fit like 16 gigabytes or maybe 32 gigabytes. And I've seen it run up to 64 or even higher gigabytes of memory load during integration. You also want to make sure that you have access to the server, because you're always going to run into issues, and if there's a long-running batch and you're going home and you get notified by the customer, well, there's an issue, you don't want to have to wait for the next morning, because then maybe you can't continue. You scheduled your job to end maybe 3 a.m. at night, so that's the next day you could continue with the migration with the next steps. But if you have to restart it in the morning, then maybe your whole plan is broken and you lose a day. So make sure you have VPN and RDP, so remote desktop access to the server where you're running on, so that you can actually access your migration and make any modifications or restart it when needed. And very important one, I had this multiple times, work with your system admin and network admin at the customer side, so that you know about any maintenance windows, any scheduled reboots, like OS updates or any downtime because they have to make some changes in their network infrastructure. Because it kind of sucks if you plan to run your migration overnight and server reboots at 2 a.m. because of a scheduled maintenance window, and then nothing happens. And you get in the next morning, you'd hope it would finish, and you see, oh, it's already failed after 10% because the server shut down. Then the other part about tooling, what you want to use. Like I mentioned, there's a couple of ETL solutions, data loader, Jitterbit data loader. They work fine for simple tables and smaller data loads, where you don't have to make transformations and the CSV files you're working with aren't too complex, aren't too large. Let's say under 200 megabytes, then it's usually fine. But like I said, if you're migrating millions of records, and also with large tables where you can have maybe 40, 50, or even 200 columns, so multiple 200 fields in Salesforce, then it's going to be so much that if you migrate that through files, you're going to end up working with CSV files of a couple of gigabytes, and that usually ruins performance and also workability. So I'd recommend using an integration platform instead, and there's quite a few leaders and large solutions that work with Salesforce. Obviously MuleSoft, which is acquired by Salesforce, but before MuleSoft was acquired, Salesforce was actually quite happy with Informatica. They often recommend Informatica in the architect tracks and also at events, so you can also definitely look at that one. And I personally used Jitterbit Harmony a couple of times, Pandaho once, and an interesting one is the lower right corner, SQL Server Integration Services. You get that one for free with SQL Server. So if you have any on-premise system running on SQL Server Enterprise, you already have this solution. So even if the customer doesn't have any other integration platform that might cost a couple thousand or even tens of thousands of euros or dollars per year, then you can still use this to do a flow-based integration solution for your migration instead of doing an ETL solution migration. So definitely take this one in mind, because quite often you already have this, even if you don't know it. Well, here's a short slide of these solutions, who are according to Gartner, the leaders. As you can see, Informatica, oh, that's the wrong one. Informatica is at the top in pretty much all of them, which is probably also the reason why Salesforce recommended them before they acquired MuleSoft. But like I said, it usually depends. Ask Gartner. It's over here, by the way. But ask Gartner. Not sure, actually. I'm not sure. What was my point again? Well, never mind. Then the automation part. Like I said, when you work with large data volumes in your Salesforce org, then you have to adjust your implementation. You have to adjust your automation, because you are much more likely to run into governor limits than when you only have a couple 100,000 or maybe even just tens of thousands of records instead of millions of records. And two things that you should definitely look into are asynchronous Apex and batch Apex, which is one of the parts of asynchronous Apex. Because with point and click solutions, everything runs synchronously, which means that if you change a record or if you insert a record, in the context of that change, process builder, workflows, and other point and click automation will go off before the result is returned to the end user. So if there's millions of records being imported, then before every record is committed to the database, it has to go through the whole cycle of automation that is implemented on that object. While as you do it asynchronously, it will just finish the whole context. So the record is already committed to Salesforce, it's saved and it's committed. The integration for your migration will move on to the next chunk of records. This will just continue. And Salesforce will determine, based on their resource availability, when they're going to actually apply the automation. It will just be queued up in a Salesforce queue. And when Salesforce thinks, well, I have the resource available now to do this automation, to do this calculation, then we'll do it in bulk. And another part of that is that you might not want to do it trigger-based at all. So maybe you don't want to do any automation, any changes when you import or insert or even adjust those records when you migrate them, but also when you're using Salesforce after the migration. Maybe you just want to do it scheduled at midnight, where the system will go over all these millions of records at once at 2 AM when nobody's working with them, and then make all those changes. Because even asynchronously, it will still affect the performance of the org while users are working in it. Whereas if you do it in the middle of the night, especially if your org is only locally, so maybe just Europe or even just one country, then it won't affect the user performance. Also very important, avoid mixing automation types on the same object. So you have workflows, you have process builders, and of course you have Apex triggers, but usually recommend to only use one and not all three of them combined. And definitely don't use multiple of the same type. With workflows, you can, would be recommended, but you definitely don't want 10 process builders on one object, or even 10 unmanaged triggers on one object. If you build a trigger, the trigger should just be one line. It should be calling a handler, and the handler should catch the trigger context, determine what kind of operation it is. Is it before updates, before inserts? Is it after delete? And based on that, determine what action should be taken. But you don't want a separate trigger for each automation type that you want to build in Apex. And another important one is any SOCL you're using in your Apex, or also in indirectly through flows or process builder, because deep down process builder and flows also convert to Apex and also use SOCL. So you can run into SOCL limits by using process builder and Apex. So you want to know how that works. And if you write the SOCL yourself inside a trigger handler or service service class used called by trigger handler, then you want to make sure that it's also bulkified, that it uses best practices to query those records. With workflows, especially when migrating, you usually want to look at any records being created that are either a task internally, but especially outbound messages and email messages. If you migrate closed-won opportunities, you don't want to notify any external partners or any customers if they closed 3 years ago. And you also might not want to integrate those records with another system that relies on outbound messages. So when you have any of those, make sure that if they're enabled, they should actually want to have them enabled and not accidentally send out all those outbound messages or all those emails. With Process Builder, there's a couple of caveats. Very important one, never use this if you have a very high bulkification requirement. So if there's millions of records required, or basically with any 200 record chunk size process, because this step will query for each record in the chunk. So let's say you have 200 records in one chunk that trigger a process builder. Then the process builder will first go through one record, determines if that step, should go into that tree, in that branch. And if it goes into this branch, it will run this query just for the one record entering the process builder. Then it goes into the next record in the context of that chunk. And again, it will query. But your query limit for in a synchronous context is 100 for SOQL, while your chunk size is 200. So if you have that, and you do a migration with a standard chunk size, you will always hit the limit. No matter what you do, you will always hit it. So if you have a requirement where you need something like that, don't build it in Process Builder. Ask a developer within your company or anywhere else and have them build it inside a trigger with a handler, because then you can actually do this bulkified. And another one is evaluate the next criteria. If you have a very, very long process, then this might look the same as one trigger where the process is basically the handler and each branch is the step that it's going to take. But in practice, this performs much worse than a trigger with a handler doing the same thing. Even though it looks the same, for some reason this underwater, under the platform, it will translate to a lot less bulkified Apex than when you build it yourself. Then with Apex, especially if you are going to migrate into a live org, you always want to have table-driven trigger and validation management, because you're going to run into issues where you would like to disable a trigger for your integration user, but you can't because it's a live org, so you can't just disable this trigger. You have to actually push a new version that's disabled through an IDE or from a sandbox through a change set before you can even continue. But if you have a trigger, a table-driven trigger management, you can just revoke or apply a permission or set a checkbox in custom metadata records, thereby disabling the trigger for your integration user. Well, I'll get to that in the next slide. And next is your trigger framework. Like I said, you want one trigger with one handler per object, and then the handler calls all the service classes. So all the functionality that actually has to be performed, any automation you want to use. And in your handler, your handler should implement your trigger framework, which can take account of your standardization, that you use one template for all your handlers. At the same time, it can handle loop prevention and error handling. Then the service layer should include all your automation that you can reuse, not just within different handlers for different objects, but also in UI controllers or in APIs. So wherever you need this certain piece of automation, make it as generic as possible so that you can reuse it. Have one generic service class with this automation and then call it from multiple places. So thereby using a real object-oriented trigger Apex model. And especially with large data volumes, it's recommended to also use a selector layer. So normally with small objects, with small data sizes, you can just use regular SOQL inside your queries because you quite often don't have a working set above 50,000 records. But when you have millions of records in Salesforce, it can be that your query is still selective, still only returns a small size of the total data set, but that small size is still way more than 50,000 records. It can even be a couple million records, especially if you have an object with maybe 100 million records in there. Then a million is still only 1%, but way more than the standard SOQL will allow for. So in that case, you would also like to implement a selector layer that will help you dynamically create your queries in like a batch Apex query selector, where you can return 50 million records instead of 50,000. And like I said before, if possible, with large data volumes, you always want to work with asynchronous as much as possible, because it usually doubles the context of the limitations within the context compared to synchronous, and your users won't have to wait for anything to be completed before the first results are shown. So you already can see the record on a page when you've saved it, or you can see the records being loaded in a Visual Force page or a Lightning component, even though some calculations haven't been performed yet. And when those have completed, then they'll see the update in their on the page, but they don't have to wait for it, because nothing annoys the user more than having to look at a loading screen for maybe a minute or 2 minutes because the system is working on something and you actually have to wait for that. Table-driven trigger management, already mentioned it. How you can implement this is through a custom metadata records, where you create one record. Okay, well, I'm closing up. I'll speed up a bit. I'll share a slide deck anyway on the Slack channel, so you can look back at all this in your own time as well. But a custom metadata record with a permission set, with a custom permission, will help you implement this table-driven trigger management. Same goes for validation management. With SOQL, I've already discussed selectivity. So you can only return a certain fraction of your records once you get above the 200K size within your object. So if there's more than 200K records in your object, then you cannot return all the records anymore if you want to. Your query has to be selective. And these are the definitions used by Salesforce for selectivity, for standard and custom indices. And this means that there's a maximum records that can be targeted after a certain threshold. So you can never return more than this many records if you use standard SOQL. The selectivity also is determined by whether it's deterministic or non-deterministic, because with non-deterministic, it's always going to do a full table scan instead of an indexed query. And it's only indexed if it's deterministic, where it always returns the same result. And if you use not equal to, or equal to null, or equal to empty string, or leading wildcard, you won't have a deterministic query. So make sure that your queries all use in with a list instead of not equal to the only value that you don't want. Then the best place for data prep and validation. So you can prep your data at various places. You have the source, which can be used if you have a SQL database and you only need simple transformations, which can be handled by a view in a SQL view. If you have more complex transformations, then you usually want to do it in flight in your integration that you use for the migration or in a staging database. Again, I just put it here for to get the complete list, but you don't want to do it in intermediate files, because then you have to transform those CSV files with all the risk involved of getting a wrong result. So I do it in a staging database if it's a complex transformation, do it in source if it's simple, or do it in flight in your actual integration that you use for the migration. Only do it in Salesforce if you need the same automation that you use for the transformation when you work in Salesforce. So if it's a live org that needs some automation, or if you need some functionality also after you're live and not just for the migration, then you can build it in Salesforce as well. Because if you have to work with it with large data volumes, it will run into the same limits when using it as you would run into when migrating. Then optimize for the purpose of data. Is it active or historical data? If it's active, then you usually want it in Salesforce. If it's historical, it might not be the best place because it will cost you a lot of data storage and will make all the limitations much more of a risk for your implementation because you will run into them faster. And also, what's the purpose of the historical data? If you're just going to report on it, it might be enough to know that the customer had 5 deals in the last 4 years or something, with a total value of, let's say, 100,000. And almost closing up. Instead of having all the records of those deals and all those contracts. So if you can aggregate, it usually will cut down your data size quite a lot. If you don't want to perform calculations on a very large data set, it's usually a better solution to move it like to a platform like Heroku, because it's actually built for use case like this, whereas Salesforce is more of a working set platform where you work with a small set, and any archiving, any data silos, any backup systems you want to use, you don't want to have it in Salesforce, you want to have it off platform. And because of GDPR, you cannot store all the things anyway indefinitely. Because of time, I have to skip the big objects and skinny tables for now. But you can ask me questions about those offline through Slack or email later. I have to go through this a bit faster. These are a couple of issues and steps that you're going to have to look into when you migrate large data volumes. You want to have a backup plan, if you want and a rollback plan, if you are going to migrate a live org, because once you start merging, once you start importing that data, it's live data, so the customer will really need that data that's already in the org, and you want to have the option to go back to that. So make sure you have a backup and an actual plan to apply that backup, because if it's the standard backup from Salesforce, it's very hard to put back because it's all CSV files, and the IDs won't be the same if it's deleted, for instance, when you put it back. Minimize the manual steps. So again, don't use CSV files, do the integration, and try to automate as much as possible. And the last, data SKUs is an important one. If you have more than 10,000 child records under a parent, the system will perform much worse. So try to avoid using one account to bundle all contacts that don't have an account, because you might end up with one account having 100,000 contacts. And if you have any of those contacts in a query or in a report, the report will perform very badly. And always also take into account block changes when you do a staged import. For instance, closed case, the audit fields like less modified by and created by, and also activated contracts. And the last one, testing reruns and error processing. Already, like I said before, you want to test your migration, but you want to test it incrementally. You don't start off with 1 million records, you start off with maybe just 10 records, then you move it up to a couple hundred records, a couple thousand, maybe 25%. And then finally you want to test the full migration, preferably the full migration. But if it's billions of records or hundreds of millions, you can settle for a fraction. But make sure you test a representative amount of the migration before you do the actual live migration. Don't just verify results by random sampling, because your sample set will never be significant if it's millions of records, because you'll be busy for a year sampling. So use aggregate SOQL to test your records and to test the migration. And if you do a pilot period or a shadow run, which is highly recommended, then again you want to use the integration approach, because you can just rerun, and the integration that you've built will take care of any matching, of any processing of those records. And for the sake of planning, you want to benchmark your batches. So if one batch takes 9 hours, you want to take that into account, so that you know how much time you need for each batch before it's completed and before you can go on to the next step. And one last slide of the aggregate circle. This is just one demo of, I want to count the opportunities and the sum of the amount of those opportunities for all the stages that are prospecting, closed won, or verbal agreements, like the list you see over here. And without sampling all those records, I can see the result right away. And this gives a much better testing approach than random sampling. You still want to do random sampling, but only for a few records to test the full scope of your integration. Are all the records transformed correctly into the right fields? But then if you tested 10 records, you want to test the rest with aggregate SOQL to make sure that you actually migrated all those records correctly by counting, summarizing, taking averages, minimum values or maximum values. And that was it. So thank you all.